Hello. Apologies for my voice. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Isaac and Tamara Deutscher Prize Lecture this year, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Jairus Banaji, who's the recipient of the prize in 2011. Jairus's prize-winning book perhaps gives a good sense of the range of interests that he's been following for some time, and perhaps more importantly the specific contribution, methodological and theoretical contribution that he offers to Marxism, and which was one of the reasons for the committee awarding him the prize last year. Written over around 30 years, Theory's history draws together a number of essays on diverse themes and periods: 6th century agriculture in Byzantium, unionized pre-proletarians in the Roman era, a Merovingian period, feudal masters and questions of rationalization, Islamic merchants in the 9th century, Latin American latifunders, Egyptian esbas, Italian city-states, 16th century German mines, and questions of accumulation, and more. While this repeated investigation of pre-modern capitalist eras might sound arcane or archaic, the propulsion of the investigation is not purely scholastic. The span and diversity of themes are part of the argument intimated in his subtitle. This is about modes of production, modes of exploitation, such that they might not fit neatly into the assumed and sometimes platitudinous categories of some Marxist historiography or modelling of epochs. There is rather incipience, repetition, overhangs, and for the theorist also, therefore, various vantage points, as well as there being various vantage points of capital and various vantage points from where capital can be perceived. At the very least, there is much food for thought and argument, which may well come out in our debates today. And it's all written on the basis of a subtle and flexible intermingling of theory and history, theory as history, historiography, and Marxiological work, not in the bad sense. All of which bears strong resonances to the multiple modalities of labour, production and exploitation today. And it resonates with these in order only to insist on their historical lineages and the possibilities for their overthrow. Jairus's research has taken him to various areas: historical, contemporary, the capitalism of the sea, for example, questions of the agrarian mode, Hegel's dialectic and its implications in Marx's Capital, Indian Maoism, fascism as a mass movement. We turn to hear him now on seasons of self-delusion, opium, capitalism and the financial markets.
This is a slightly long lecture, so I'll try and rush through it, and I hope it's going to be comprehensible, because the faster I sort of read, the less comprehensible it might actually seem, but I'll try and do my best. The first appearance of the... Can you hear me? Yeah? The first appearance of the term fictitious capital in Volume 3 is in the heading of Chapter 25, Credit and Fictitious Capital. Yet curiously, the term itself appears only twice in the main body of the chapter, and on neither occasion is it Marx himself speaking. The first occasion is an excerpt from the Yorkshire banker Lehman, who as early as 1840 discusses the humongous circulation of bills of exchange, adding that this was what today we might call a completely unregulated market. Quote, "The bills of exchange are not placed under any control, except by preventing the abundance of money, excessive and low rates of interest and discount, which create a part of them and encourage their great and dangerous expansion." Again, "It's impossible to decide," Lehman continues, "what part arises out of real bona fide transactions, such as actual bargain and sale, or what part is fictitious and mere accommodation paper, that is where one bill of exchange is drawn to take up another running in order to raise a fictitious capital by creating so much currency. In times of abundance and cheap money, this I know reaches an enormous amount. So this is 1840. So here, fictitious capital is used to refer to accommodation bills. That is, those bills of exchange that were either purely speculative or part of an outright swindle. The second occurrence of fictitious capital in chapter 25 comes in a parenthesis inserted by Engels, who described the speculation in bills of exchange that involved massive overtrading to India and other parts of Asia in 1847 as, quote, a method of creating fictitious capital and, quote, a fraudulent procedure to boot. Marx himself refers to this as, quote, swindling in the East India trade, where bills were no longer drawn because commodities had been sold, but rather commodities sold in order to draw bills which could be discounted and converted into money. So for Marx, this was a credit swindle, and he was careful to describe it simply as a system of fictitious credit, a method where, quote, fictitious credit was created by means of accommodation bills. This is in a piece he wrote in 1858. He states here, the latter were discounted chiefly by joint stock country banks, which rediscounted them with the London bill brokers. The London bill brokers, looking only to the endorsement of the bank, that's the Bank of England, not to the bills themselves, in their turn relied not upon their own reserves, but upon the facilities afforded to them by the Bank of England. Now, hopefully what this introduction does is suggest at least three things. It suggests that chapter 25 is not where we should look for Marx's understanding of fictitious capital, even if the chapter heading promises something in that direction, because it's got the term in the title itself. Second, it suggests that bills of exchange were pivotal to the nature of Victorian capitalism. And third, that the financial system of the city involved an entire interlocking system of London brokers, banks, discounting and accepting houses, and of course the Bank of England. It was the bank that stood behind the London bill brokers, or discount houses as they came to be called, and it was the bank's last resort facility that in some sense sustained what Lehman had called the enormous superstructure of bills of exchange. It's in chapter 29, in other words 4 chapters later, that we get a better sense of what Marx means by fictitious capital. Here he disaggregates banking capital into 1, cash, and 2, securities. The latter may again be divided into 2 parts. This is a quote. That securities can be subdivided into commercial paper, current bills of exchange that fall due on specified dates, their discounting being the specific business of the banker, and public securities such as government bonds, treasury bills, and stocks of all kinds, in short, interest-bearing paper, which is essentially different from bills of exchange. So you've got commercial paper and public securities being the main part of what he calls securities. And Marx adds mortgages too can be included in this category. That's under securities. Now the distinctive feature of this class of assets, the various types of interest-bearing paper that Marx refers to, is that they represent, quote, claims, legal titles to future production. Either a claim to certain sums from the overall proceeds of taxation, in the case of government bonds, treasury bills and so on, or a claim to a share of corporate profits. In either case, the capital value of these securities is purely fictitious. This is the sense of fictitious capital. It's the value. It's the capital value of these securities that is purely fictitious, since it bears no relation to the actual determination of value in the production and circulation of commodities. Marx himself identified the formation of fictitious capital, that is, the peculiar determination of its market value, with capitalization. But of course, in modern financial markets, the value at market prices of securities like credit default swaps and most derivatives has nothing to do with capitalization in that sense. All the same, quote, the greater part of this money capital is purely fictitious, he says, in the sense that its money value is, as Marx says, completely fictitious. It's the value which is fictitious. Their values can rise and fall quite independently of the movement in value of the actual capital to which they are, or more precisely, may be titles. The capital that is fictitious is money capital, and at the end of chapter 30, Marx even suggests that fictitious capital is interest-bearing paper par excellence, more than bills of exchange. In other words, of those two classes of assets, it's interest-bearing paper, the securities that he talks about, that really constitutes the model type of fictitious capital. So two final points. Fictitious capital circulates as money capital on the financial markets, and, quote, in all countries of capitalist production, there is a tremendous amount of so-called interest-bearing capital or moneyed capital in this form. Again, another quote, in times of pressure on the money market, they, that is these securities, are put up for sale in massive quantities to be converted into money. Again, quote, their depreciation in a crisis is a powerful means of centralizing money wealth, and that's been borne out by the recent banking crisis, where you have two banks in particular, two American investment banks, emerging as the major winners in the game, in the crisis. And Marx calls this a devaluation of money capital, although the values we're talking about are in a sense fictitious. Now let me come back to the Bill of Exchange by a rather circuitous route. The re-internationalization of the city from the 1960s was bound up with the rapid evolution of a new international money market, namely the Eurodollar market, the founding stone of today's international financial system, as Gary Byrne calls it. An unofficial, unregulated and unrestricted international money market dealing in expat dollar deposits held in a very liquid short-term form. A wholesale money market that led not just to the restoration of the city's fortunes in the 1960s, but even more dramatically to the re-emergence of global finance, which is actually the title of Byrne's book, The Re-Emergence of Global Finance. What the creation of the Eurodollar market did in the late 50s was provide the city with a way of acting as a center for international finance without imposing a strain on Britain's depleted gold and currency reserves. It was restrictions on the use of sterling that triggered the great expansion of the Eurodollar market, which took place towards the end of 1957. What emerged was a merchant bankers market that inherited a large part of the institutional structure and techniques from the city's Victorian system for financing international trade. As Byrne says, the advent of the Eurodollar market finally allowed the city to regain its autonomy lost in 1931. So it's a momentous event. It's the transition from the old financial system to the new financial system that we see emerging in the 70s and 80s. If you want a transmission belt between the two, it's the emergence, the very rapid evolution of this market, the Eurodollar market, which of course today we talk about the euro currencies and euro currency market. But it's just as interesting, as he tells us repeatedly, that the institutional framework of that market was, quote, borrowed from the Victorian London bill market by city traders like Sir George Bolton, suggesting an astonishing continuity in the structures of British capitalism. So basically, the mechanisms of the Victorian age are retrieved, reconvened, as Gary Byrne keeps saying throughout his book, reconvened in order to allow for the evolution of a completely new kind of money market, which is the euro currency market. So bills of exchange drawn on London financed most of the world's trade in the 19th century. Marx described the bill as, quote, the basis of the credit system. And in Volume 3, he even describes capitalism as a system of production where the entire interconnection of the reproduction process rests on credit. Bills of exchange could be sold at a discount to face value in order to obtain immediate funds. And because they enjoyed such ready negotiability in the London bill or discount market, they were an ideal means of financing world trade. To make the bill of an overseas merchant discountable on the London money market, a London merchant bank would put its signature on it, thus, quote, accepting it. That means guaranteeing it. Accepting was a commission business controlled by leading merchant banks of the ilk of Barings and Schroders. These banks were also known as accepting houses. The Bank of England stood behind the bill dealers and the discount houses, prepared in extreme circumstances to rediscount their better quality bills. That means in a crisis, prepared to rediscount their better quality bills. Because the bank was prepared to do this, the houses were able to finance their massive bill portfolios with money that could be withdrawn virtually at a moment's notice. That is, from the call money market. With the phenomenal growth of deposit banking in Britain in the 1850s, the joint stock banks began to employ an increasing portion of their reserves at call with the city's bill brokers, and were willing to do so because the Bank of England would be willing to discount the bills, in effect acting as lender of last resort to the dealers. Relations between discount houses and joint stock banks were intimate and continuous, for the bill brokers not only sold large lines of bills to the banks, but borrowed substantial sums of money from them on a day-to-day basis. So this is the classical money market that sustained British capitalism and world capitalism for close to 2 centuries. It's the the Victorian bill market that Marx is familiar with. Now, bills of exchange were used both to finance the trade in opium and as a means of remitting opium profits to Bombay, Calcutta, and London. Till the early 1830s, the most sought-after bills were those issued by the East India Company on Calcutta or on the Court of Directors in London. Of course, in addition to company bills, there was a vast volume of private paper in circulation. Jamshedji Jijiboy, almost certainly the biggest dealer in opium on the Indian side and a major client of Jardine Matheson and Company, with whom in the 1830s he was transacting more than £1 million worth of business. This is an Indian businessman transacting more than £1 million worth of business with the merchant house of Jardine Matheson in the 1830s. He remitted, that's Jamshedji Jijiboy, remitted about £150,000 each year to London through China, thanks largely to the good offices of William Jardine. As the late John F. Richards suggested, already by the 1820s, the greater part of private returns from the opium trade that returned to India went to the mercantile communities of Western India, not Bengal. The huge volume of Malwa opium that flooded the Chinese market in the 1830s was dominated by indigenous merchants. The opium lobbies in the so-called native states, or the princely states, that's in the western parts of present-day Madhya Pradesh, and the big dealers at the Bombay auctions. Bombay's fortunes were built on opium, as Amar Farooqi argues in Opium City. When in 1831 the company finally relented and allowed Malwa opium to be shipped through Bombay on payment of a transit duty, Jamshedji ran a massive combination to monopolize the Malwa trade, seeking to have as much of the supply as possible consigned to Jardine Matheson at Canton. So successful was this combination, writes Asiya Siddiqui, that at its height, something like a third of the entire quantity of opium to leave the shores of Bombay was going to the warehouses of Jardine Matheson in China. As it happens, the leading houses in the China opium trade were also by far the largest of the British traders in this period. Okay, so who are the biggest British, merchant capitalists in the 19th century? They're the opium traders. By the 1860s, Jardines were handling close to £300,000 worth of opium on commission each year, apart from investing heavily on their own account. Now, the private English in China, the term is private English, an expression laced with irony, since there was a preponderance of Scottish names among them, had the backing of the great East India houses, a number of old and powerful firms in the city of London. Jardine's list of merchant banking houses whose paper they endorsed included all the big names. Most of these could be drawn on for large sums. With Fairley and Bonham in London, Jardine's bills account doubled every year between 1827 and 1830. The expansion of Britain's eastern trade was largely developed by family and clan groups organized as agency houses, a congeries of fluid partnerships that, in principle at least, drew the bulk of their profits from agency commissions as opposed to speculation or trading on their own account. If you traded on your own account, that was called speculation. I mean, your kind of normal source of profit was commission business. All the agency houses depended on the powerful support of city firms like Fairley, who for their part competed vigorously to grant acceptance credits on international commodity business. Leading trading companies like James Finlay and Company could open any number of accounts for acceptance credits. For example, in 1871, the Glasgow head office of this agency house advised the Calcutta and Bombay branches that the Royal Bank of Scotland would cover acceptances to the extent of £100,000. But Finlay's also had accounts with the Bank of England and Baring Brothers, while the Indian branch had their own accounts with the London merchant banks. So there's a very tight nexus between the city on the one hand and all the kind of colonial trades, including the opium trade, that kind of flourish in the course of the 19th century. The city is literally the pivot of the international trading system. Now, Marx was thoroughly conversant with the nature of the bill market and how, for example, banks would create capital by reissuing bills of exchange, or how the London bill brokers carried on their enormous transactions without any cash reserve, as he says, and how the East India trade tied in with the financial mechanisms of the city, periodically blurring the tenuous boundary between trade and speculation. He also knew that the East India Company had rapidly converted the cultivation of opium, this is a quote, rapidly converted the cultivation of opium in India and its contraband sale to China into integral parts of its own financial system, as he'd said in 1858. Most of the best stuff that Marx writes about issues like the opium trade obviously comes in his journalistic writings, which are quite phenomenal. I mean, they're really good stuff. What is not there in Marx, at least in so many words, is a totalizing picture of how the peasant hinterlands of British capitalism were integrated into the expansion of capital, whether that of the trading houses that were connected with the city or of industry itself. And opium is a good example to look at, not just because it was probably the largest commerce of the time in any single commodity, as Michael Greenberg describes it, but because the hesitation that stopped Marx from proposing an integrated model of accumulation is reflected crucially in a passage that deals precisely with opium. And since this is an interesting passage, I'll cite it in full. In a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, 1859, when discussing the decisive function of money as means of payment, Marx writes, "In the transaction M to C, money as a real means of purchase may be alienated, thus realizing the price of the commodity before the commodity is handed over. This happens, for instance, in the well-known form of advance payment, also in the form of payment used by the English government to buy opium from Indian ryots, riot being the term for a peasant, and is largely used by foreign merchants living in Russia to buy goods produced in that country. In these cases, however, money functions only in the familiar form of means of purchase and therefore requires no new definition." Now, this is what he qualifies with a footnote when he says money functions only in the familiar form of means of purchase. At this point, he adds a footnote. Of course, capital too is advanced in the form of money, and the money advanced, he means in these advance payments, may well be an advance of capital. But this aspect doesn't lie within the scope of simple circulation. So he allows for the possibility that we're actually dealing with a circulation of capital and not with a set of transactions between buyers and sellers in the sense of simple circulation. In short, Marx is uncertain whether to treat the advances under which so-called Bengal opium was grown in India merely as a set of transactions between a mass of independent producers and their single buyer, the government, or as a circulation of capital. It makes a big difference which of these models we adopt. He knew that the opium monopoly, or that part of it relating to the cultivation of poppy, was based on a mixture of compulsion and enticement. The British government, he wrote, compels one part of the Indian ryots to engage in the poppy culture, entices another part into the same by dint of money advances. This was a view abundantly supported by the evidence proffered to the Royal Commission on Opium as late as the 1890s. Bengal opium was grown in an elongated tract along the eastern Gangetic Valley in present-day eastern UP and Bihar, and the bulk of the evidence thus relates to this region. By the evidence, I mean the evidence of the Royal Commission, which dates from the 1890s. Poppy was grown in the richest fields of the village, on the rich loams, and needed constant care and labour for nearly 5 months, down to the lancing of poppy heads and scraping of opium, which took about a fortnight. Quote, "The cultivators are generally poor." These are citations from the Royal Commission, the minutes of evidence. "The cultivators are generally poor, and they make the members of their families work hard," said one clergyman, since cultivation of the poppy needed 2 or 3 times as much labour as the other spring crops. So it was incredibly labour intensive. Poppy is a crop specially suited to small holdings where a large return has to be gained by minute and laborious cultivation of a small area. In other words, it's a typically Chayanovian crop. I mean, this is the sort of crop that Chayanov classically attributes to the family labor household, or the peasant family labor household. This is it's a typically small peasant crop, okay? Especially suited to small holdings where a large return has to be gained by minute and laborious cultivation of a small area. Nearly all the peasants engaging for opium with the state were either kachis or koiris, subcastes of skilled gardener cultivators who excelled in raising the specialist heavy crops of tobacco, vegetables, and opium. Heavy in the sense of labor intensive. The sub-deputy opium agents dealt directly only with the village headman, who in turn mobilized lists of cultivators willing to enter into the engagement to sow. New advances were dispersed at the end of September through these village intermediaries, and peasants sowing less than the area engaged for were liable to prosecution under Act 13 of 1857. In other words, once you've actually entered this contract or signed the agreement, then you're liable to prosecution if you don't fulfill the terms of the agreement. To the opium agents, that is the government, what the cultivator entered into was a legal contract. And in the case of indigo, of the indigo industry, Macaulay compared these contracts to the contracts between capitalists and workers in Britain. He said that they're remarkably similar to those. Richards describes the rates paid per seer of crude opium, I think a seer is about £2, of crude opium as a carefully calculated minimal monopoly price. Since there's only one buyer, the government, it's a minimal monopoly price, usually 4 or 5 rupees a seer, much less in the early 19th century. There was solid testimony throughout the century that opium was cultivated at a great loss to the mass of those engaging for it. So why do they grow it? The commission asked one minor zamindar. Because the government advances the money, was his main response. The advances were a powerful inducement because the vast mass of peasants in these parts of the country were tenants at will, subject to the exactions of both landholders and moneylenders. Quote, "They could never pay their rents but for the opium receipts," said one sub-deputy opium agent in the Bihar agency. This actually illustrates the sheer complexity of the system at a local level. They depend on the opium advances to pay their rents. Now, as punctuality in the payment of revenue is rigorously enforced, they, the smaller landlords, would be in serious difficulty were it not for the opium advances to the ryots, upon which the Mahajans advance the installments of rent payable to the zamindars. It's incredibly complex. You have moneylenders, you have landlords, smaller landlords, you have peasants, and you have rent demands, and you have fiscal demands, all interlocking together in ways that have to be the system has to work from season to season. There has to be a sort of temporal coordination between these payments. The advances were interest-free, that is, their sole purpose was to establish a legal claim on the peasant's labor time, which in practice meant a substantial quantity of unpaid family labor. Balls of crude opium were weighed and tested for adulteration around the middle of April, and the agreed rates paid only for the finest quality crude. The opium was then placed in earthen jars, which were sealed and dispatched to the factory in consignments of 100. The manufacture of provision or export opium went on from May to the end of July. Opium from the Bihar factory contained 75% morphine, that from Bengal 71%, following a process called alligation, that's with an I, alligation, that is mixing opium of different consistencies. Opium cakes were then packed into chests of about 130 to 40 pounds at the rate of 500 chests a day, and these dispatched from the factory to Calcutta by special trains. The opium was then auctioned at Calcutta to private traders like Jardine Matheson when they traded on their own account. So here is the circulation of capital, or rather, here is a capitalist industry structured in a peculiar way, in a way that doesn't conform to the classical version of capitalism that's working in Britain at the time. And let me just say what I think is happening is that what we have to do is that the figure of the circuit of money capital that Marx deals with in volume 2, in various parts of the early parts of volume 2, he talks about the figures of the circuit of money capital and apart from the other circuits of capital. And so it has to be modified in the following way, that the transaction M into C, all right, converts not into M into C, which splits up into labor power and means of production. If you can remember the figure, C is then subdivided into labor power and means of production. It splits up basically into C, which is equivalent to labor power, which subsumes means of production, because the company isn't buying the peasant's land, or it isn't establishing a claim on the means of production in any significant sense. So I think the best way to look at it is that the circulation of capital subsumes labor power, which subsumes means of production. In other words, the means of production come along with the labor power, and obviously the capitalist, in this case, that's the state, has no particular interest in owning those means of production. They go with the peasant. They're part of the peasant household. So I think you can talk about the subsumption of means of production in this sense, but the essential modification is that the C doesn't divide into labor power and means of production. It just translates into labor power. That's what the opium advances are. Opium was India's largest export item for most of the 19th century. Her chief source of the large annual inflows of bullion from China, and the one commodity more than any other that financed a substantial part of the UK's trade deficit. The UK was permanently, it always ran a trade deficit throughout most of the 19th century, and opium was a large part of the story as to why that was viable, why it was possible. In the 1870s and 80s, an average of over 90,000 chests, or 5,700 metric tons of opium, left Indian ports every year. On the East India Company's estimate, the Chinese were importing enough opium to supply over 2 million smokers in 1835. By the 1880s, that's around 50 years later, the massive escalation of exports from Calcutta and Bombay had triggered the emergence of domestic supply areas in the south and west of China, and the scale of consumption was certainly closer to the 40 million smokers estimated by some scholars than the simply incredible figure of 2 million cited by the head of the Imperial Maritime Customs in 1881. If you have to choose between 40 million smokers by the 1880s and 2 million, I'd go for 40, okay? William Jardine and James Matheson were both Whigs and strong advocates of a showdown with the Chinese authorities in the interests of securing what Jardine described to Palmerston as, quote, liberty to trade with the northern parts of China. If we can get it, he said. As early as 1834, James Matheson had denounced the new Foreign Secretary, the Duke of Wellington, as, quote, a strenuous advocate of submissiveness and servility. In other words, to the Chinese government. Palmerston, who was Whig Foreign Secretary from April 1835 to September 1841, was altogether more sympathetic to the commercial interest at Canton. When the showdown finally came in 1839, Jardine was on his way back to Britain. Arriving in London in September, he went to see Palmerston and, as J.Y. Wong writes, literally masterminded the government's approach towards China and the Opium War, down to details such as the size of ships to be deployed and the terms of the treaty to be proposed to China, leaving blank only the names of the islands to be occupied and the amount of the indemnity to be exacted. This is the best study we have of the way the opium trade worked in terms of British politics is Wong's book Deadly Dreams. Quote, seldom has a private business had more effect on public policy, notes Sir Robert Blake, the company's biographer, the biographer of Jardine Matheson. But Jardine was the epitome of a whole constellation of interests connected with the city, where, of course, he was widely respected. So I think it misses the point to say seldom has a private business had more effect on public policy, because between public policy and that particular private interest lay a whole nexus of a whole constellation of interests. Those interests and the peculiar nexus between the city and the Foreign Office were even more strident in 1857, when the chief London firms connected with the China trade, some 20 in total, a deputation of literally hundreds of leading bankers, merchants, ship owners and brokers of Liverpool, and even Lloyds of London, rushed into battle armed with the strongest expressions of confidence in Lord Palmerston. To open China was the slogan under which the Arrow War was fought. That's the Second Opium War. To open China was the slogan. The same wild vistas of an immense extension of trade, dreams of an inexhaustible market, as Marx commented with his usual dour realism a year later. In the Figures of Dissent, a key argument of Anderson's revolves around the notion of a disjuncture between the city and nascent domestic industry. This is the second of his two famous sort of seminal pieces in New Left Review. This was written, I think, sometime in the mid-80s, in 87. If so, it certainly wasn't obvious in either of the Opium Wars when the Manchester associations were a vociferous part of the war lobby. All the same, and this is an important qualification because it turns the whole argument around, Anderson's general thesis that the nature of British capitalism has been irreducibly shaped by the core operations of the city as a complex of British capital seems scarcely controversial to me. Seriously, I mean, Pache Thompson, whom I otherwise support in every other respect. The only sector of manufacturing that has ever really mattered to the British state is Britain's defence industry. Think about it. I mean, which sector of manufacturing has ever mattered in Britain except defence? Okay, well, anyway, it's a hypothesis. When Sindh was annexed in 1843 and the massive flows of Malwa opium deflected from Karachi to Bombay, the income from transit duties alone could exceed 2 to 3 million pounds in the 1860s. Just the transit duties on Malwa opium. Once Sindh was annexed, Karachi was under British control, the exports could be deflected to Bombay. Britain's occupation of Egypt in 1882 had more to do with the bondholders than any conceivable manufacturing interest. You might have said, well, surely it's the cotton industry that wants a regular, stable supply of cotton, raw cotton from Egypt, but it's actually the bondholders who run Egypt at this time. The bondholders are now in possession of Egypt, as the radical writer Frederick Harrison said at the time. And of course, it was the Egyptian exchequer in the 1880s that paid for Britain's conquest of the Sudan. The annexation of Upper Burma in 1885 was again linked to powerful commercial and financial interests connected both with the London Chamber of Commerce and with the Rothschilds. Certainly the 1880s were one of those seasons of general self-delusion, as Marx called them, when a plethora of capital gushed into every conceivable channel. The city poured billions in present-day terms into South American securities, and its speculations in Argentina left bearings with liabilities that threatened to crash the entire financial system in 1890. As the city's historian tells us, not only would the failure of the city's leading accepting house inevitably bring down a host of other firms, including all the discount houses, but the very status of the bill on London would be threatened, and thus the preeminence of the city as an international financial centre. What Barings faced was a liquidity crisis, and the solution cobbled together over one tense week was a rescue package that coordinated infusions of capital from the government, the bank, and the city. Of course, the architect of that rescue package was Lidderdale, who was the governor of the bank at the time. Had Barings been allowed to collapse, most of the great London houses would have fallen with them. Natty Rothschild is reported to have said, "About £6 million worth of bills are drawn daily upon London, and an enormous proportion of this business passed through their hands," he says. Okay, so let me fast forward by a century to a financial world that is vastly more complex and more integrated globally. It took barely a decade, roughly from 1987 to 97, for the American investment banks to break the entrenched positions of the UK merchant banks. In other words, a structure that had been built up over decades and centuries was just wiped out in the course of 10 years, literally in the course of 10 years. And the UK merchant banks were literally wiped out. In a final assault around the mid-90s, 6 of the city's top investment banks were sold to overseas competitors in little more than 18 months. This is a quote from Philip Auger. The British merchant banks were like Eric Santner's stranded objects in the high-octane world of the 1980s, when traders on the fixed income side started driving the profitability of Wall Street firms, and banks like Bear Stearns became major underwriters of mortgage-backed securities. So it's basically the fixed income traders who start driving profitability in the Wall Street firms. It's the bond market which emerges as the cutting edge of finance and one dimension that I've completely ignored in this lecture is the institutional investor. It's the shadowy, obscure, low-key figure of the institutional investor that stands behind this complex of transformations that you're seeing in the 70s and 80s. It's their money which is buoying the financial markets in the 80s. Mortgage securities were bonds created out of pools of several thousand mortgages that entitled the bearer to a share of the cash flows from the pool. Securitization creates fictitious capital, and mortgage bonds were a good example of how the US investment banks could actively create markets for fictitious capital almost overnight. So securitization, in other words, transforming debt into a negotiable instrument, into securities which can circulate in the market and so on, is essentially a process of creating fictitious capital as opposed to trading it. What was striking about the frenzy of innovation that seized the banking sector in the 80s and 90s was the sheer rapidity with which such markets were being created and expanded and tied into each other. Collateralized mortgage obligations, CMOs, were created out of mortgage bonds, which had been created out of mortgages. So you have these three levels of abstraction. You have the initial debt, you have the securitized debt, and then you have the derivative form of that. So you've got three levels of abstraction. It's like this process of externalization that Marx refers to from time to time in Volume 3 is exemplified here in a dramatic way. The externalization of these forms of capital. Synthetic CDOs were fabricated out of credit default swaps on different tranches of other CDOs. And credit default swaps preyed on a host of other markets, notably CDOs made up of subprime mortgages, and more recently, the sovereign debt markets of the Eurozone. So what I'm suggesting is that these markets are preying on other markets, and they're all interlocked in this way. I mean, the whole CDS market, the credit default swap market, depends on a whole host of other markets that are linked to it. Credit default swaps are contracts that enable one side to hedge a long position. If you've got a lot of a certain security, then you're long in that, and you buy a credit default swap to hedge your position. But hedgers need speculators to take the other side of the trade. So the distinction between hedging and speculation is completely abstract. It's artificial. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't work like that in the real world. Okay, I mean there is no fundamental distinction between hedging and speculation, except from the standpoint of the individual money capitalist. So hedgers need speculators to take the other side of the trade. And in 2006, when the total notional value of the CDS market hit 26 trillion, up from just 800 million in 2001, well over half the CDS bets outstanding were pure speculation by people who didn't hold the underlying assets. In financial derivatives and the globalization of risk, Lee Puma and Lee suggest that the overaccumulation of manufacturing capital in the US economy generated an abundance of speculative capital. So they trace it to a crisis of profitability in the manufacturing sector in the US, which was already evident by the 70s and 80s. The idea that an excess of speculation stems from a lack of profitability in the wider economy is, of course, an old one, and is found in different guises in John Stuart Mill, Marx himself, and Henrik Grossman. In fact, Tony Norfield's recent paper in HM cites a fascinating passage from John Stuart Mill. He's the first to propound this kind of idea, that it's a lack of profitability in manufacturing in the wider economy that is fueling speculation. In his classic work, Grossman argues that the plethora of capital that builds up as capitalism is increasingly characterized by an absolute overaccumulation of capital is released. It's like pressure being released, partly through the export of capital and partly by enormous bouts of speculation on the stock exchange. These are the mechanisms by which a complete collapse of profitability is averted. In other words, this fits very well because the whole idea of the world being divided into emerging markets, the whole notion of an emerging market and so on begins to emerge in the 1980s, precisely as the export of this sort of capital into those markets is being driven by a crisis of profitability in order to avert a complete collapse of profitability. So expansion into emerging markets from the 1980s, or globalization, or whatever you want to call it, fits very well with this kind of argument that Grossman makes. Let me just state the position I'm endorsing here, which is that the more mature capitalism becomes, the more it faces a crisis of overaccumulation. It's just that it's a trend. All right? That doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have periods within that trend which can lead to dramatic reversals of a decline in profitability. I agree completely with Anwar Sheikh's piece in Socialist Register, recent piece in Socialist Register, where he says that from the 1980s you had a sharp attack on wages, and that this did contain the decline in profitability, apart from the impact of low interest rates and so on. These general determinations, in other words, those that relate to the trend, are fundamental, but it doesn't help to contrapose them, as Grossman does, to Hilferding's comments on speculation in a remarkable chapter of Finance Capital. The great irony about Finance Capital is that its essential thesis is untenable. It was even untenable when Hilferding wrote it, which is this notion of banking capital as a fusion, of finance capital as a fusion of banking and industrial capital. I mean, the German banks were not micromanaging German enterprises, and they had no interest in doing so. And Germany had vibrant securities markets at the time. So I mean, finance capital, the theory that he actually offers us, is in some sense the least interesting part of this particular chapter that I'm referring to, is the one on the stock exchange. Not only is financial speculation characterized by a massive use of leverage and by what Hilferding calls the greatest possible rapidity of turnover, what Marx in the Grundrisse calls circulation without circulation time, which is literally true today. You have circulation without circulation time. I mean, it's literally true. Okay? But no less importantly, speculation, says Hilferding, has an objective social function under capitalism, namely to provide liquidity to the markets for fictitious capital, to keep them, quote, open for business at all times, and, quote, so give money capital as such the possibility of transforming itself into fictitious capital, and from fictitious capital back into money capital. So it's a fascinating circuit that Hilferding is describing, an endless circulation between the forms of money capital and fictitious capital back to money capital, which is essentially what the financial markets are all about. These are massive and highly concentrated markets today. For example, at year-end 2006, the top 10 counterparties accounted for 89% of all CDS trades on a notional basis. That's credit default swap trades on a notional basis. Just 10 counterparties account for about 90% of all trades. The $72 trillion worth of credit default swaps outstanding in 2008 were held by 17 banks, with Lehman Brothers holding 7 trillion of them. Massive concentration in these markets. Or take this final statistic. In the first quarter of 2010, the notional value of derivatives held by commercial banks in the US was $212.8 trillion. That's commercial banks. Of the 1,000 odd commercial banks that submitted information on their derivatives exposure, the top 5 claimed 97% of this notional value. Just 5 banks. The global capital markets work on overnight loans. Now, this last bit of the lecture deals with what I'd like to call the mechanisms of the banking crisis, namely what actually did the banking crisis involve in terms of its internal mechanisms. And it's about competition. It's about what Marx calls many capitals. We tend to have an incredibly academic view about what goes on in the field of competition, but competition is vicious. It's always at work in capitalism, and it can take extremely virulent and kind of pretty destructive forms. The global capital markets work on overnight loans. Unlike commercial banks, the investment banks do most of their funding overnight in what's called the repo market, using the assets they hold as collateral. The collapse of the Bear Stearns hedge funds that triggered the first round of financial panic in June 2007 was brought on by margin calls from the repo lenders, with some lenders like Lehman and Credit Suisse seizing collateral to sell into the market. Now, most of this collateral, of course, are these mortgage securities, okay? The Bear hedge funds had a total of 11.1 billion in repo financing from 16 Wall Street firms. Of course, Bear's own, that's the company itself, apart from the hedge funds, the company had about $70 billion in repo financing, which it had to keep rolling over day after day or night after night. And of course, the irony is, as William Cohen tells us, the very same banks that were repo lenders to the funds were up to their eyeballs in the same illiquid mortgage securities that the funds had. It was the evaporation of liquidity in the short-term money markets in the middle of 2007 that signaled the emergence of a major crisis and forced the ECB to inject 95 billion pounds into the overnight lending market at that time. That's in 2007. Bear's own collapse in the spring of 2008 was brought on by short sellers speculating in the credit default swap market and telling counterparties at other firms that they had concerns about Bear's liquidity and solvency, which drove the cost of spreads wider and made funding more expensive. These are just rumors being circulated in order to destroy Bear. By the fateful second week of March, Bear's overnight lenders were all gone, and the hedge funds had started pulling their prime brokerage accounts from the firm. On Thursday of that week, that's March 13th, 2008, Bear went from solvent to dead and was scooped up by JP Morgan for $10 a share. I mean, some of this comes into Wall Street number 2, the second Wall Street. I mean, some of this is there in there, including this figure about 70 trillion in outstanding CDS contracts and so on. But Paulson apparently wanted Bear to be bought at $2 a share, but ultimately they settled for 10. The big winners in the crisis were JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. They are the big winners I referred to earlier. There were many at Bear Stearns who believed that Goldman fomented the negative sentiment and trading that doomed Bear Stearns in its final week. Goldman, quote, supposedly bought puts, shorted Bear's stock, and or encouraged hedge funds to pull money from the firm. In short, engineered a run on the bank. I mean, I'm building this whole account on these two excellent books by William Cohen. One deals with Goldman Sachs, one deals with Bear Stearns. The demise of Lehman some months later in September was clinched by the extraordinary fact that the Fed agreed to expand the collateral that investment banks could pledge as part of its suddenly contrived rescue facilities, but denied Lehman access to the discount window. In other words, it expanded the definition of acceptable collateral, but said no to Lehman. It said you can't access the discount. You can't access loans. No public money, Hank Paulson said at the time. Yet Paulson had no trouble putting billions of taxpayer dollars on the line for both Bear Stearns 6 months earlier and AIG, the giant insurer, 2 days later. So it seems extremely selective. I mean, 2 out of these 3 companies are bailed out. One is left to die. That one being the 4th largest investment bank on Wall Street. On September 16th, 2008, the federal government poured $85 billion worth of taxpayer money into AIG to keep it from falling into bankruptcy and in effect took over the company. The Fed gave the counterparties, that's AIG's counterparties, 100 cents on the dollar. The second largest of these was Goldman Sachs. AIG was brought down by its exposure to credit default swaps since it was consistently on the wrong side of the trades. Bear and Lehman by their vast accumulation of assets that soon became worthless. The ability to take short positions through the credit default swap market was a major part of the way the banking crisis played out. For example, by allowing Goldman to become significantly short the market by the end of January 2007, when the other banks were still collecting vast amounts of collateral to ram into their CDOs. Goldman's net exposure to the mortgage market was virtually flat by March 2007, and by April it was aggressively marking down its residual mortgage securities with lethal consequences for other firms. This refers to the mechanism called marking to market, okay? So this is the devaluation of fictitious capital that's beginning to occur once Goldman decides that it's not going to accept the value of securities at whatever it is, 100 cents and so on. It's going to bring them down. There's an aspect of all this that I haven't looked at all, which is how the price of a lot of this fictitious capital is actually determined. It's completely arbitrary. It's a largely arbitrary process. It's a process of negotiation and deals between the main players in the market. Altvater In conclusion, Al-Fatah has argued that credit default swaps are perfect instruments for speculation on defaulting sovereign debts, and indeed that speculators have been targeting the Eurozone by attacking the weakest link in the chain in the European periphery. This is his piece in Socialist Register, From Subprime Fast to Greek Tragedy. There is now increasing evidence to suggest that as countries move into distressed debt situations, the bond market adjusts to the CDS market and not the other way around. In other words, it's transactions in the CDS market that are driving bond prices and yields. In other words, speculators in the credit default swap market exert a major influence on sovereign bond spreads, with the devastating consequences this has for the mass of the population in countries like Greece and Spain, and of course elsewhere as well.